Jim Crow was never just a set of Southern laws tucked away in history books. It was a nationwide system, quiet in some places, brutal in others, that reshaped everyday life across the United States long after slavery officially ended. Its influence reached far beyond courtrooms and legislatures. It determined where people could live, which schools their children attended, how communities were policed, who could vote, and whose stories were allowed to matter. For many Americans, Jim Crow is remembered through familiar images: segregated water fountains, whites-only signs, and buses divided by race. But those images tell only part of the story. In cities outside the South, discrimination was often enforced without signs through housing contracts, school zoning, hiring practices, and unwritten rules everyone was expected to follow. The result was the same: separation, exclusion, unequal power. This system did not rely solely on open hostility. It survived through routine decisions, paperwork, silence, and the idea that inequality was simply the way things were. Entire generations grew up navigating barriers that were invisible to some and unavoidable to others. And when the civil rights movement challenged the most obvious forms of segregation, Jim Crow did not vanish, it adapted. That is what this story is about. Because if we only see Jim Crow as a closed chapter, we miss its warning. We miss how systems of inequality can outlive the laws that created them. We miss how history shapes the present in ways that feel normal until they are questioned. So as we begin, ask yourself this: what if the most dangerous part of Jim Crow was not what it did openly, but what it taught society to accept quietly? If you value stories that uncover the deeper truths behind history, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Your support helps keep these conversations alive and helps ensure that lessons history tried to teach us are not forgotten. If Jim Crow was a system that taught inequality to survive quietly, then the story of the Groveland Four shows how loudly that system could still speak when challenged. What happened in Lake County, Florida, in 1949 was not an accident, nor was it an isolated failure of justice. It was the predictable outcome of a society trained to see accusation as proof and race as guilt. That summer night, when a young white woman claimed she had been attacked, the machinery of Jim Crow moved with frightening speed. 4 black men, Ernest Thomas, Samuel Shepard, Charles Greenlee, and Walter Irvin were named before evidence was gathered, before facts were tested, before truth had any chance to breathe. In a legal environment shaped by fear and hierarchy, their identities mattered more than the details of the case itself. The accusation alone was enough to seal their fate. Inside police custody, the promise of law became something else entirely. Interrogations were driven not by the search for truth, but by the demand for confessions that would satisfy public outrage. 2 of the men were forced into statements they later recanted, while Ernest Thomas fled in terror, knowing that escape might be his only chance to survive. He was hunted down and killed before ever seeing a courtroom, a reminder that under Jim Crow, even the presumption of innocence could be lethal. The trials that followed offered little relief. Evidence was weak, testimony inconsistent. Yet convictions came swiftly. Samuel Shepard and Walter Irvin were sentenced to death, while Charles Greenlee received life in prison. Then, in a moment that still defies belief, Shepard and Irvin were shot by the sheriff while being transported for a retrial. Shepard died on the roadside, and Irvin survived only by pretending to be dead. The official explanation claimed self-defense. But the message was unmistakable. The system would protect itself, even when its actions made justice impossible. What makes the Groveland Four especially haunting is not only the violence they endured, but the length of time it took for the truth to be acknowledged. Decades passed as families carried the weight of shame that never belonged to them, as official records preserved a lie, and as the country moved forward without correcting the damage left behind. It was not until the 21st century, more than 70 years later, that courts formally recognized what had been wrong from the beginning. These men had been innocent. Their exoneration did not erase the lost lives, the stolen futures, or the years spent under the shadow of false guilt. But it did expose something essential about Jim Crow's legacy. This was not simply about bad laws or biased individuals. It was about a structure that rewarded certainty over fairness and speed over truth. The Groveland Four were not just victims of their time. They were warnings, showing how easily a system designed to exclude could turn justice into performance and punishment into spectacle. When their names were finally cleared, the moment felt less like closure and more like a reckoning delayed far too long. Their story reminds us that the end of segregation on paper did not immediately end its consequences in practice. Jim Crow did not disappear when laws changed. It lingered in courtrooms, in official narratives, and in the silence that allowed injustice to stand unchallenged for generations. If the tragedy of the Groveland Four revealed how Jim Crow treated those without power, the lives of Nat King Cole and Hattie McDaniel reveal something equally unsettling. Even fame could not shield Black Americans from a system built to remind them of their place. Success, rather than offering protection, often placed them in clearer view of the very barriers they were expected not to cross. By the late 1940s, Nat King Cole was one of the most recognizable voices in America. His records played in homes across the country. His music crossed racial lines, and his image projected elegance, optimism, and universal appeal. Yet when Cole purchased a home in a wealthy Los Angeles neighborhood, his celebrity meant nothing to the neighbors, who believed the area was not meant for someone like him. Lawsuits were filed to block the sale. When that failed, intimidation followed. Racial slurs were burned into his lawn, and his family lived under the constant reminder that admiration from afar did not translate into acceptance up close. Cole chose to stay, refusing to retreat. But the message was clear. Success did not grant belonging. This contradiction defined the Jim Crow experience outside the South. In cities that prided themselves on progress, discrimination often hid behind contracts, customs, and quiet hostility. Nat King Cole was welcomed on stage, applauded by audiences of all backgrounds, yet rejected in the most basic expression of stability and safety: a home. His story exposes how Jim Crow functioned not only as a legal system, but as a social boundary enforced by everyday choices. Hattie McDaniel's story carries this contradiction even further. In 1940, she made history as the first black performer to win an Academy Award, a moment that should have marked an undeniable breakthrough. Yet the night of her triumph revealed the limits of that recognition. She was seated away from her castmates, placed at a small table against the wall in a segregated venue, allowed to attend only by special permission. The award celebrated her talent, but the setting reinforced her exclusion. McDaniel understood the complexity of her position. She was praised for her performances while being criticized for the roles available to her. Caught between a film industry that restricted her opportunities and a society that judged her for surviving within those limits. Even after achieving the highest honor in Hollywood, her career stalled, and her choices narrowed rather than expanded. The celebration of her success existed alongside a refusal to treat her as an equal participant in the world she helped shape. The injustice did not end with her death. McDaniel's wish to be buried in a prominent Hollywood cemetery was denied because of her race, and the Oscar she left to a university later disappeared, its absence becoming a symbol of how easily black achievement could be misplaced, forgotten, or dismissed. Her legacy survived, but not without reminders of the barriers that defined her life. Together, the stories of Nat King Cole and Hattie McDaniel deepen the pattern already revealed by earlier chapters of this history. Whether through false accusations, legal manipulation, or social exclusion, Jim Crow operated with remarkable consistency. It allowed black excellence to be consumed, celebrated, and profited from, while denying black individuals the dignity and security that should have accompanied their accomplishments. Their experiences challenge the comforting idea that progress naturally rewards merit. Under Jim, achievement did not dismantle barriers. It merely tested their strength, and time after time, those barriers held firm, reminding America that inequality was not a failure of talent, but a design carefully maintained across every level of society. By the time stories like those of the Groveland Four, Nat King, and Hattie McDaniel had entered public memory, Jim Crow no longer needed courtroom drama or celebrity headlines to do its work. Its most durable influence was exercised quietly, through neighborhoods and classrooms, shaping lives long before any accusation was made or any spotlight turned on. Housing and education became the everyday mechanisms through which segregation reproduced itself, especially in places that insisted it had moved beyond Southern-style racism. Across American cities, racial covenants were written into property deeds with deceptively calm language. They did not shout exclusion. They formalized it. These clauses restricted who could buy, rent, or inherit homes, often barring black families, as well as other minorities, from entire neighborhoods. Even after the Supreme Court ruled such covenants unenforceable in the late 1940s, the habits they created remained intact. Real estate agents steered buyers away from certain areas. Lenders denied loans through discriminatory assessments, and local officials looked the other way. Segregation survived not because it was loudly defended, but because it had been normalized. The consequences of these housing practices reached far beyond geography. Where families lived determined access to resources, safety, and opportunity. Well-funded neighborhoods built stable schools, attracted investment, and accumulated generational wealth. Segregated neighborhoods, by contrast, were systematically deprived of those same advantages. This divide did not happen by accident. It was reinforced by policy decisions that treated separation as a neutral outcome rather than a deliberate design. Education followed the same logic. In theory, schools outside the South were integrated once overt segregation laws fell. In practice, school zoning mirrored housing patterns so precisely that classrooms became as divided as ever. Children attended schools that reflected the racial and economic boundaries drawn around their neighborhoods, inheriting inequality before they had the language to describe it. A child's future was often decided not by talent or effort, but by the address written on a registration form. These systems worked together with remarkable efficiency. Housing determined school quality influenced economic mobility, and economic outcomes reinforced residential separation. The cycle repeated across generations, making inequality appear self-sustaining rather than constructed. For families trying to break free, each step forward encountered invisible barriers. Higher prices, limited options, or institutional resistance disguised as routine procedure. What made this form of segregation especially powerful was its ability to exist alongside claims of progress. Cities pointed to the absence of explicit segregation laws as evidence of fairness, even as outcomes told a different story. The lack of warning signs or written prohibitions made discrimination harder to challenge and easier to deny. It allowed society to insist that inequality was the result of personal failure rather than structural design. This quiet segregation explains why success stories like Nat King Cole's did not translate into full acceptance, and why injustice like the Groveland Four case could unfold in communities that believed themselves modern and lawful. The system did not need to announce its intentions. It operated through boundaries that shaped daily life so completely they were rarely questioned. Housing and education were not secondary effects of Jim Crow. They were its long-term strategy. By controlling where people lived and how children were taught, the system ensured that inequality would outlast the laws that created it. Even as America spoke the language of equality, these structures preserved separation, reminding us that the most enduring forms of injustice are often the ones that appear ordinary, familiar, and easy to overlook, as housing and education quietly shaped who had access to opportunity. Political power became the next boundary Jim Crow learned to guard. When open segregation lost its legal footing, the system did not abandon its purpose. It refined its methods. The right to vote, once denied openly through intimidation and exclusion, became regulated through procedures that appeared neutral on the surface yet carried familiar consequences beneath. In the years following the civil rights movement, the language of democracy shifted. Laws no longer announced who could and could not participate. Instead, participation was filtered through eligibility rules, district lines, and administrative decisions that claimed to protect fairness while steadily narrowing access. The ballot box remained, but the path to it grew more complicated for some communities than for others. Felon disenfranchisement laws became one of the most effective tools in this transformation. In several states, individuals who had completed their sentences found that punishment did not end with release. Their right to vote was suspended indefinitely or for life, often tied to categories of offenses written into constitutions long ago. These laws were not accidents of history. Many were crafted during the Jim Crow era itself, designed to reduce black political participation without naming race directly. Over time, they remained in place, even as the society around them claimed to move forward. The effect was cumulative. Communities already impacted by unequal policing and sentencing patterns saw large portions of their population removed from the electorate. Families lost just income earners or stability, but political voice. Democracy, in theory open to all, became selectively accessible in practice. Gerrymandering reinforced this imbalance. By redrawing district boundaries, political power could be concentrated or diluted with mathematical precision. Neighborhoods were divided, communities split apart, and voting strength redistributed in ways that ensured certain outcomes long before any ballot was cast. These maps did not need to mention race to achieve racial effects. They relied on data, geography, and precedent, creating districts that looked orderly on paper while undermining meaningful representation. Voter purges added another layer of quiet exclusion. Registration rolls were regularly updated, often removing individuals for missed elections, minor clerical errors, or outdated information. In theory, these actions maintained accuracy. In practice, they disproportionately affected communities with higher mobility, fewer resources, and longer histories of marginalization. The burden of correction fell on voters themselves, who were required to navigate complex systems to restore a right they believed they already possessed. What ties these mechanisms together is not simply their outcome, but their design. Like housing covenants and school zoning, modern voter suppression operates through structure rather than spectacle. It avoids confrontation and relies instead on endurance. Each rule appears reasonable in isolation. Together, they form a barrier that many never realize they have encountered until participation is denied. This evolution of Jim Crow reveals its most enduring lesson. Systems of exclusion do not require public endorsement to function. They only require enough complexity to obscure intent and enough time to normalize results. Political power, once stripped openly, can be restricted quietly, wrapped in legal language and procedural justifications. The struggle for the vote has always been about more than elections. It is about recognition, belonging, and the ability to shape the future. When access to that power is unevenly distributed, inequality becomes self-perpetuating. Jim Crow may no longer announce itself, but through modern voter suppression, its logic continues to shape who is heard and who is left waiting outside the democratic process. The story of Jim Crow is often told as a journey with a clear ending, a dark chapter closed by new laws and moral awakening. But history rarely works in clean lines, and the deeper lesson left behind is not one of closure, but of continuity. Jim Crow did not simply vanish when its most visible signs were removed. It adjusted, learned, and carried its logic forward into new forms that blended more easily into everyday life. What we have seen throughout this story is a pattern that repeats across time and place. When one method of exclusion became unacceptable, another quietly took its place. Segregation moved from signs on walls to boundaries on maps. Disenfranchisement shifted from open denial to procedural complexity. Inequality survived not because it was loudly defended, but because it was patiently redesigned. Each generation inherited systems shaped by the last, often without being taught how or why those systems came to exist. This is why historical memory matters. Forgetting does not erase injustice. It preserves it. When the past is treated as distant or irrelevant, the structures it created remain free from scrutiny. The danger is not only in repeating old mistakes, but in failing to recognize them when they return under different names. Democracy depends not just on laws, but on an informed public capable of questioning how power is distributed and whose voices are missing. Civic vigilance is not about suspicion. It is about responsibility. It means understanding that progress is not permanent and that rights, once won, require ongoing care. It means listening to histories that challenge comfortable narratives and recognizing that fairness in theory does not always mean fairness in practice. The strength of a democracy is measured not by its ideals alone, but by its willingness to confront the gaps between those ideals and reality. Jim Crow's legacy reminds us that injustice does not need to be obvious to be effective. It can operate quietly, through routine decisions and accepted norms, shaping outcomes long after the original intent has faded from view. The task of each generation is not to assume that equality has been achieved, but to ask where it is still being withheld. As we close this chapter, the goal is not to dwell on the past, but to learn from it. History offers warnings as much as it offers lessons, and those warnings are only useful if we choose to hear them. Protecting democracy requires more than remembrance. It requires engagement, awareness, and the courage to challenge systems that no longer serve justice. Thank you for spending this time with us and for listening to this story. If you found value in this exploration of history and its lasting impact, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and continue the conversation. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that the lessons of the past remain part of our shared future.